Hi, so we're here for week 2 of the Fabric Mart Fit Along. And last week we went over how to pick your size, how to prepare your pattern for tissue fitting, and some fabric choices that you could make for this design. Now I have right here my body map sheet, which we're gonna give you a link to, as well as the tissue fitting order. So just in case you forget the order that we do it in, you can always reference this sheet here. And I'm gonna use the body map sheet to mark down the adjustments that I'm gonna do on Julie during the tissue fitting. We're gonna get started in the tissue fitting with the bodice. And I'm gonna slide the tissue on Julie. And now Julie's a pro at this, so she knows exactly what to do, but sometimes people would drop their arm immediately, and look, that tissue's not all the way on. What you really wanna do is get the tissue so the base of neck at the shoulder is at her base of neck. So you wanna really get that tissue all the way on. Don't be afraid, it's tissue. If it tears, you can tape it, it's not a big deal. All right, so I'm making sure that it's all the way up on her base of neck. And I'm pulling it taut, and now you can lower your arm, Julie, thanks. So she's anchoring the tissue there. And we always start in the method, we always start at the back. So I'm trying to get her center back to her center back. Now let me just lift your arm again and make sure that the side seam is at your side seam. And it is. Now you can drop it, that's great. So in the upper back, it is definitely, the center back is reaching to Julie's center back. Now, do you mind holding your hair? Thanks. Is reaching to her center back up there. But I'm noticing that she has a little tiny bit of a high round in her upper back area. And I know this because she mentioned to me before that she always gets gaping behind her neck. So I'm gonna do this adjustment, not because she's so round, but because I think this will help her with that gaping problem in the back of her neck. So that's about 3/8 from the stitching line to her base of neck. So I'm just gonna note that on my form right here. And that's gonna fix that gaping problem. Now the center back width is good. It's a little, like she needs a little more room right here, but I know that we're gonna do a full bust adjustment, so I'm gonna wait to do that before I do anything with this dart. Now I'm really noticing, this is so obvious, that she has this huge bubble right at the back of her shoulder, right there. And I actually had to look in the Palmer Pletch Fit for Real People book to figure this one out because I hadn't seen this before. But what she has is not a high round back. Sometimes that can indicate a high round, but she has a very prominent high shoulder blade up here. Some people have more prominent shoulder blades down a little bit further, but hers is way up here. So what she needs is a dart. Darts point to curves. So she has a curve, so she needs a dart. So I'm gonna take out a few of these pins in the shoulder so I can get that dart in there. And I'm literally just draping this dart to her body, taking out as much of the back shoulder as I need to make this shoulder curve to her shoulder. Now, one thing I want to be careful with this, putting a shoulder dart in, I'm repinning it now at the shoulder seam. See how that really went away? Yeah, I mean, I could even take it in a little bit more at the shoulder seam. I'm kind of just draping the tissue on her body at this point, but that bubble really went away. And I just want to make sure that the stitching line in the pattern is coming all the way to where her armpit is, essentially. So that would be where her armhole is going to be set in. I don't want it to become too narrow. If it's too narrow, we may have to extend the back to meet the front. But I have a hunch that she has narrow shoulders, so I'm gonna leave that for right now. Let me see how that looks. Oh yeah, that looks so much better from the side. It's just way more flat. Now to the front. I'm gonna have you lift your arm a little bit again. We're gonna make sure it's all the way up there, and you can drop it. Okay. Now, the center front is not quite making it to her center front. And I can see it's kind of tricky because this is actually the wrap part of the pattern. The center front line is over here. Now I'm gonna fit about a ½ inch away from her center front because we are using a knit. If we were using a woven, I would bring this line all the way over to Julie's center front. But because we're using a knit, I want it to stretch across her body a little bit. I want it to be a little bit tighter. So I'm gonna fit about a ½ inch away. So we'll do a 3/4 full bust adjustment. And then after we're done with the bust adjustment, we can see what other alterations she may need to take. So I've unpinned all of my pattern pieces except for the back dart that we added, and I'm ready to start doing my alterations. Now, remember we added that back dart for her shoulder blade, her prominent shoulder blade. So before I take those pins out, I'm just gonna mark the pins on either side of that dart that I made. And then I'm gonna mark that end point, which was about right there. And that end point was just where I pinned, and it just kind of subtly ended where her shoulder blade started. So it just, you know, it's natural. It's whatever the tissue does. Now I can take these pins out, and you can see the marks where my dart is going to be, and I'm just going to true that up. So to do that, I'm just going to attach those marks together and draw a straight line. Now this is going to distort the shoulder seam up here, but don't worry about that just yet. We're going to try it back on Julie before we do any changes to that shoulder seam. She may have a forward shoulder. Okay, and now I'm going to do the 3/8 of an inch high round back. To start doing this, I'm just going to put the center back on a straight grid line right here, and just anchor it anywhere. It just makes it easier. And now I'm going to draw. I know the high round back line on the tissue is printed right here. We're actually going to draw a new high round back line. So now I'm going to draw that line just right across the back, and I can almost follow this grid line underneath. It happens to be at the perfect place. And I'm going to draw that line so all the way through the shoulder seam, and it starts right at the base of the neck. That's your new high round back line. So on all of our a little bit older patterns, the high round back will be down here, but we're going to just draw it up there right below the stitching line. Now, I'm going to anchor the pattern where that stitching line intersects the line that I just drew for the high round back, and I'm going to cut on that line. All the way up to the pin, to that hinge, but not through that stitching line. I actually may go a little bit further. You want to be able to hinge it. Now I'm going to pin the bottom part of the pattern down and put that pin back at that hinge. And now you can see this top portion of the back of the pattern can just swing up. So I'm going to swing it up 3/8 of an inch. So it's very little, but I think it's really going to help that issue that Julie has with her back neck gaping. And then I'm just going to take my perfect pattern paper and fill the high round back alteration that I just made I'm gonna fill it up and then just tape it back together. I'll just put some pins in there so the tissue doesn't fly up at me. Great, so we're done with the back now. Now we said we're going to do the full bust adjustment to the front on 1.5 inches. I'm gonna line up the pattern, the center front line on the pattern with a grid line once again. I'll do the bust adjustment first, but remember we're gonna have to do something to this side. So we're gonna always cut, the Palmer Plush patterns are indicated with alteration lines printed on the tissue, so it makes it super easy. You're gonna cut on line 1, and line 1 goes up through the apex and then over to the armhole. Now you're going to cut up to the stitching line, but not through the stitching line, just like that hinge that we did before. Now, I'm gonna swing line, I'm gonna put a hinge first, a pin there at that hinge. Now I'm gonna keep this side of the pattern free, and I'm gonna swing this line out until I reach 1.5. And the 1.5 comes from this line 2 at the apex point. I'll just pin that down. And I'm measuring it over to line 1. So let me move over a little bit more. There we go, there's my 1.5 full bust. And I've put the pin at the top of line 2, and now I'm gonna cut in towards the apex on line 2. Now I've cut on line 2, and I'm swinging line 2 down to be parallel with line 1. So I'm just kind of eyeballing it right now, but I'm gonna measure over here to make sure it's still 1.5. So I went a little bit far. There we go. I'll measure in a few places. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong. There we go, okay. Yep, that looks about perfect. So that's 1.5. Now the last thing that we need to do is cut on line 3. Now line 3 is over here. I'm gonna cut all the way across line 3. And we'll pull this bottom piece down so it's level with the bottom hem, the waistband, the waist seam of the other side of the bodice. So I'm just gonna pull this down a little bit more, and that looks about right. And I'll anchor right here. So this measurement isn't something that's exact, you just pull it down so this becomes level. And now I am going to fill this hole, all these areas in with tissue. Okay, now I'm gonna pin everything down, make sure it's nice and clean. And I will tape everything together. So I've taped everything down, and I'm starting to trim off the paper, the extra tissue paper. I'm just going to true up. This is now becoming a bust dart right here. So you see this portion that opened from the full bust adjustment? This will now be Julie's bust dart. So I'm just gonna pin it together. And I'm gonna fold it down. This is a very easy way to true up a dart. And then that extra tissue, I'm just gonna trim off. And there's no right or wrong way to fold a dart. If you want to fold the dart up, you can totally do it up. I like to fold my darts down, so I did it down. And then it makes that nice little dart angle right there. Now, remember this is a wrap dress, so the width that we added to the left side, we now need to add that width to the right side because this is passing her center front. So this essentially is the left side of her body. So we need to do the same thing to the left that we did to the right. The alteration line 2 inches away from the center front. I am picking that arbitrarily because my ruler is 2 inches wide and I don't really want to get too close to the center front when making the line to add width. So I'll just draw this alteration line. I'll pin this guy down, cut on this line that I just drew. And I'm going to move this 1.5 inches, keeping the hem, the waistline stitching line parallel. So making sure I'm not moving it up or down from there. It will distort this angle, but I'll show you what to do with that in a second. So I'm going to add 1.5 inches. I'll just make sure that I gave enough there. Yeah, that looks good. Pin this down, and then I'm going to fill that up again. Now we just need to true these 2 points. That point and that point. We need to connect them again. Everything else we don't need. That's why I didn't fix this part up when we lengthened it, because I knew we were gonna widen the right front of the bodice. So just to connect these points, it's really easy. I'll just draw that straight line, and then I'm just gonna trim this off. And we've done all of our alterations for the front and the back of the bodice, and I'm gonna go try it back on Julie and do the final fitting.
Hi, I'm Julie Brown, and you're watching the Fabric Mart Fit Along.
So we have the tissue back on Julie, and I'm really happy so far. The back looks really good. I'm just noticing that she still needs a little more room at the waist, but she also doesn't need this back dart right here because it's not pointing to anything. Remember, her shoulder blade is kind of high and it's more poignant up there. It's pretty straight down here. So if a dart is pointing to nothing, you can just eliminate it. So I'm just gonna take those pins out. And just lift your arm a little bit. There we go. Now drop it. Perfect. And now her center back is coming to her center back. So just eliminating that dart was perfect and enough room to get it. And now remember also that we're not fitting all the way to her center back because we're doing the same thing to the back as we are to the front. We're fitting about 1/2 inch away from her center back. So that looks really good, you know, a little bit of extra or less room in there, so we can use a knit and it will stretch a little bit. Now in the front, that's looking so good. The full bust adjustment, you know, it's coming about 1/2 inch away from her center front. It looks really good. The reach around it looks great. And now I just want to look at your forward shoulder. You definitely do have a forward shoulder. The reason I can tell this is because the shoulder seam is not coming to the center of your arm. The center of your arm is about right there. So just turn towards me again and I'll adjust this forward shoulder. Put my pen down. And to adjust the forward shoulder, all you're gonna do is take out the pin at the tip of the shoulder seam, and then the second one, you're gonna leave this pin closer to the neckline where it is. So you're only adjusting the outer edge of the forward shoulder. And to do that, I'm just gonna slip the back towards the front, the back of the pattern towards the front, and the front of the pattern is going to slide up. So essentially, it's going to need to be longer in the back to come forward, and we'll trim off the extra shoulder length in the front. Remember when we were talking about your shoulder width, Julie? It looks like this seam is coming right into your armpit crease. So that width looks good to me for your shoulder width. Now we have all of this extra because adding that dart reduced the width of the shoulder. Sometimes if you add a dart, you would need to add back to the width of the back shoulder because this would be too narrow now. But she's narrow shouldered, and so the front of the pattern we actually need to reduce. You can see how the stitching line is coming way past the crease in her armpit where it should be. It's way over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark, matching the stitching line on the back, just make a few marks where I want her armhole to be on the front. And then I'll true that up back at the table. And it should come to about nothing right when it starts to go into her armpit. Now, I notice you have your waistband on here, and this is where Julie wants her waist to be, her waistline to be. It's really great to use an elastic band, and you'll see, especially with the skirt fitting, to have a placement for where you want your waistline to be. And Julie's pretty long-waisted, so we're gonna I'm gonna measure from the stitching line to the top of the waistband. And it's about 1.25 inches. It was about 1.25 inches. I think it slid down a little bit. And I don't want to add too much. So again, I'm measuring. Does that feel good for you? And take a look in the mirror. See if you like the way that. Yeah, that's why we have this great big mirror, so you can check yourself out. So there is the stitching line, and there's the top of the waistband. So I'm going to add 1.25 inches to the length. I'm going to add it to the front and the back, although I can see you don't need the length as much in the back. So we'll just try it back on afterwards, and I'll mark your waistband, even though I know it's going to be too long. It just needs to match at the side seams. That's always your control point, is the side seams. All right, so let me take this back to the alteration table, and I'll meet you back here after these are done.
All right,
yeah?
Sounds good.
Thanks. So now I have my pattern over here, and I've unpinned the side seam. I can't unpin the shoulder seam until I mark that forward shoulder adjustment. So I need to mark where those pins are now, those second 2 pins. And that's going to be my new shoulder line. So I'm going to just mark it on the back and also on the front before I take those pins out. And that one stays the same, so no need to mark that pin. Great. I'll go from nothing to 1/4 inch at the armhole, and that's going to be my new stitching line. On the front, I have those pins, and it was just about 1/4 inch. Looks like a little more on the front, but it could have just slipped. So I'll just take about 1/4 inch off the front shoulder seam. And now I need to add my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance back to this shoulder seam. So I'll just mark that right there, and I can trim it off the front. Again, I marked from nothing at the near the neck, and then the alteration came from the shoulder point. And on the back, I'm going to need to now add seam allowance back because we lost seam allowance by raising that shoulder seam. So I have a perfect pattern paper strip right here for this alteration. And I'll just pin this down and tape those together. And I will add here my seam allowance back, so 5/8. And I can see that green line really well. Perfect. And I'll just trim this up, and then I'm finished with my forward shoulder adjustment right there. Perfect. Now I just want to remember that we're not going to use this back dart, so I'm just going to put an X through the back dart so we don't use it, because remember, Julie didn't need it. Now I need to lengthen the back and the front the same, so it'll be 1.25 inches. And I'll pin it down. It's really helpful to use the grid line on my cutting table. So there is, oops, I'll move that over so I make sure I'm pulling it down evenly. That center back line on a vertical grid is helpful. And we'll go down 1.25 inches. There we go. And I'll fill the back in. I need to remember that these vertical pleats, they got moved, and I actually forgot to tell you this before, so I'll tell you now. They got moved when we did the full bust adjustment. So I want the pleats to be more directly underneath her bust, and one was moving way over to the center front. So what I did is I just measured the original width of the pleat and then the original width in between the pleat, and I moved 2 pleats over to the left. So it's a very easy thing. You just start with the very most left pleat, and I just moved them over. So my green lines right here are where my new pleats began. And I just crossed out those other lines so I didn't get confused. Now, I'm going to lengthen this, but first I'm going to true up this shoulder seam. And I'll need my armhole curve to do that. And I can basically just pretty much follow the marks that I made with my armhole curve. I might have been a little bit dramatic there, so I'm just gonna make it a little bit straighter. And then I'll add 5/8 again back to that stitching line. It's a little more difficult to add the seam allowance back when you're doing it on a curve. Great. And now I can just trim that excess tissue off. Great. Perfect. And now that's her new armhole. And the same thing for the lengthen and shorten line on the front. It also got distorted because of the full bust adjustment. So I'm just going to pick the one on the left-hand side of the front bodice, and I'm just gonna draw a line so it goes all the way over to the right edge. And that'll be my lengthen and shorten line. I mean, this bodice looks like it's been an engineering project. There's a lot that has gone on, but it's really great practice. Great, so I'm just going to lengthen the front just as I did the back. I'm gonna finish filling this in and then I'll meet you back at the mirror and we can do the last bodice fitting on Julie. So now that I have the tissue back on Julie, I'm just gonna check to make sure that the waist length worked, and it did. I'm seeing the stitching line is coming to the top of the waistband, and it comes all the way to the top of the waistband at the side seam. I'm looking, the forward shoulder worked really well. It's coming to the center of her arm now. And I just want to check the last thing is that if she has a sway back. Now, she's very straight in the back. She doesn't really have a sway. What this extra length is, it's from adding the length in the, for the front. We had to add the same in the back. So what I'm gonna do is just mark the top of the waistband. Let me just find it there, perfect. I'm gonna mark where the top of the waistband is up until the side seam because that's where it meets perfectly. And that's gonna be her waistline seam for the bodice, for the back of the bodice. The very last thing after that is I'm going to just check the bust dart on Julie. Now, it looks just a little bit high, but a lot of times these bust darts will fall in fabric because fabric has much more ease and give than tissue. So I'm gonna leave it as it is. It's not too high. And then we'll check it again in fabric. And if it's too high, then I can just reposition it. Also, she may be different from the right to the left, so we'll do that alteration then in fabric. All right, I think we're good to fit the skirt and the sleeve now.
Great. In next week's episode, we will be tissue fitting and adjusting the skirt and the sleeve.
There's something moving tonight. Well, can't you hear it?